Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for the delay, but welcome you all to the second day of the CII Strategy Edge Masterclass series. Just like yesterday, we have a fascinating series lined up today, fascinating session rather. So we have Professor Anindo Ghosh, Heinz Rahl Chair, Professor of Business, Leonard N. Stern School of Business, New York University, who will be, delivering his talk on using AI to monetize the mobile economy. Uh, we have Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, Executive Chairman and founder 5F World, also who will be sharing his perspectives on the forum. So without further ado, I would request Dr. Natarajan to please introduce Anand. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Jay Surya, and welcome, Anindya. And pleasure to have all of you here. And I'm sure I'm as excited about as you about this session. And just to kind of tee it up, I mean, I think all of us are now very familiar with two big phenomena that's happening in our lives. One is, of course, COVID, which has forced social distancing and new styles of management and everything else that we did not imagine possible. And the second, of course, is digital. Again, as I mean, there's a cliche which says that 10 years of digital transformation have happened in 10 months, and which is probably true because I mean, either because of the push of COVID or because of the pulls of customers, we are seeing digital galloping worldwide as well as in India, and that's great news. My own research, and in fact, the new book I'm publishing is on the concept of digital re-engineering, and the idea being that if digital transformation has not really taken off in the first 5 years, it's really because people really took it as one more technology. And I think the companies which have been successful are those who have looked at it in its total perspective. And in fact, we're now researching, in fact, we did almost a year of research on customer journeys and how people are really considering buying, servicing brands. The second, of course, is business processes, because I mean, there's a old cliche which says that you can take fifth generation technology, but you can't implement that with third generation processes and first generation people. And that's something that we are very actively engaging, saying that, look, how do you transform business processes using digital touchpoints? The third, of course, is what you would expect, people. And we do have this problem of digital natives colliding with digital immigrants. And we are finding that everybody has to come to the party and be 24/7 to make it really a successful process as we go along. And the fourth and the most important thing that we see is this whole data and analytics theme, which kind of segues into what Professor Ghosh is going to talk about today. And if you really look at data and analytics, again, most of us have started off using master data management and data warehouses and data marts, etc. But even till about a year back, I mean, when we surveyed about 100 companies in Asia, we found that close to 85, 86 of them were still, when they talked about big data and analytics, it was still very much post-mortem or descriptive analytics. And I think it took a lot of hype around AI and machine learning to really kick the ball a little bit and say that, look, let's look into the future. And again, people like Amazon telling you what book friends of yours bought and what you were likely to see in the future with Netflix. I think we've moved into the realm of predictive and prescriptive analytics in a big way. So having said that, I think if you look at the definitive technologies that we're all talking about today, I mean, starting with the SMAC stack, social, mobility, analytics, and cloud, and very much moving towards edge technologies. I mean, we mentioned AI. There's a lot of work going on today on augmented reality and virtual reality. There's stuff going on IoT and robotics, and of course on blockchains, which initially were kind of almost synonymous with Bitcoin. But today people are realizing that whether it's smart contracting or people talking across continents, countries, companies, blockchain is becoming important. So which brings me to, I think, a very, very important topic that we're going to discuss this evening. And I was fascinated when I read the summary of Professor Ghosh's book, because I think what he's really talking about is we all have a wealth of data hidden in our mobile phones. I mean, we don't even know what's there, and we sometimes worry about the intrusion. But at the same time, if you look at that as one of the biggest assets, which you literally have with you all the time, and then you apply what I call commonly available technology uncommonly well, then you have the big opportunity of AI, blockchain, etc., really working with your mobile data. And I think that's what Professor Anindo Ghosh is going to talk about. Very quickly, I mean, let me just read a few things which I found very interesting in his profile, apart from, of course, the core introduction. But if you look at what Anindya does, I mean, he's was named by Poets and Quants as one of the top 40 professors under 40 worldwide in 2014. and one of the top 200 thought leaders in big data and business analytics, which, as I said, is one of my core interest areas. Also, he's been one of the youngest recipient of the prestigious Informs 155 Distinguished Fellow Award. And of course, lives in my favorite city, which is New York and NYU Stern. And I think, I mean, I won't read through the whole thing. I'm sure all of you have seen the resume, but he's received 16 Best Paper Awards and nominations, including Faculty Research Awards from Google, Microsoft, Adobe. So we're really privileged that, in his various work that he does in consulting for people like Apple, Alibaba, CBS, et cetera, and the kind of work that he has done in this whole area of technology, it's going to be absolutely amazing to listen to you, Anindya. So over to you, and maybe you take your time and make your presentation, then we'll have a chat, and then we'll throw it open to audience questions. If audience wants to post on the chat, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll still have time at the end for you to ask your question. Over to you, sir.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you, guys. That was a fine introduction. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation with you and with the audience. So thank you again to CII and Jayasuriya for inviting me. Jayasuriya, do you have the slides shared on the screen?
I'll just do that.
Yeah.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, I can see it now. Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, so the agenda for this, I guess it's morning here in New York City and evening in India. The agenda today is I'm going to walk you through some of the work that I've done over the last 20 years, working with a variety of different companies in different countries in trying to monetize consumer data and monetize in a way that is sort of a win-win for both consumers and companies. And, it's been a very enlightening journey. There's been a lot of hiccups, impediments, and challenges along the way. So, we've been hurt, bruised, but like they say, you never quit. So we kept plodding along, and over the last few years, we've learned a few things, and which ended up in a book of mine, which is titled Tap, which is what you see over here. And this is a brazen plug of the fact that it's been translated into a few different languages. But the core theme of my book is, how to use artificial intelligence from a very different angle to monetize the mobile economy. Okay? So next slide. Okay, so how did this all start? Many years back, I was having this conversation with a group of C-suite folks like you guys, and we were talking about, the next generation of corporate battles, right? And I think we were all sort of unanimous in our consensus that in the past, the winning companies were the ones who were able to figure out the known needs of their known customers, okay? Using a variety of analytics and business intelligence and causal modeling and data mining. But in the future, my prediction was in the future, it's going to be those companies who are very good, if not great, at identifying the unknown needs of their known and unknown customers. Okay, and this is where the role of AI really kicks in. And I look at from a methodological training, I do both causal and predictive model along with prescriptive stuff. And this is where sort of the power of AI really kicks in. Okay, so in the next slide, what I'm talk about is the framework. Okay? So the framework to me is simple, and sometimes simple is powerful. The framework is for any company that wants to win, right? You need to have three key things. First, you need to have a presence in mobile. Mobile is going to be the most significant source of your consumer data. Second, you need to invest in AI and in analytics and data science. This is the toolkit, right? There are four fundamental pillars of AI. There's causal, prescriptive, predictive, and then of course, the storytelling piece. So you need all of that. And then more recently, I've been working with some companies in trying to use blockchain to ascertain the quality of the data, right? So, if you go back to the three V's of big data, we all know about volume, velocity, and variety, but the next V is veracity, which is how do you find out if the data is bona fide or not? And this is where we have started using blockchain. Okay? So next slide. So what I'll talk about today is, again, just to give you a very big picture overview. Since the last 16 years, I've been essentially taking a deep dive into using very atomic consumer level data that comes from a variety of different sources Initially, it was the internet. Then, as smartphones penetrated, I started working with smartphones data, and then social media boom happened. Obviously, that was a great source of data. And then more recently, I've started looking at how to integrate the same consumers offline and online data, right? Like, let's say you go to a physical store, but you're also browsing on your smartphone or your desktop. And this is going to be a key part of the next few years. Companies are able to integrate the same consumers online offline profile. So the work, I probably won't get a chance to talk about the entirety of my work, but to give you a flavor, it cuts across several different countries and companies and industries. And the method perspective, again, just to give you an overview, is going to be various toolkits in AI that comes from both predictive and causal modeling, but also descriptive stuff. And you'll see flavors of experiments in machine learning and econometrics as we go along. Okay, so next slide tells you the 9 forces. The core theme of my book is over the last 15 years, as I was doing this research and also applying this in the industry in various countries, we came up with this framework called the 9 forces model. The 9 forces, each of them is unique in that they are on their own important in predicting consumer behavior in this really massive mobile economy that's worth like $3 trillion. But it turns out that while they're independently important, there's also non-trivial synergies between them, such that when you combine 2 or more forces, the sum of the individual parts is greater than the whole. Okay? And this is something we have seen time and again. A lot of the examples I'll talk about that will come from Asia and Europe and North America and South America, you'll see it'll be the confluence of more than one force. Okay? So location obviously is, everybody's aware of what location data is, but I'm going to give you some more color on some of the other forces. Okay, so next slide. Let's start with the first example. This comes from one of my favorite cities in Asia. This is Seoul in South Korea. So more than a decade back, I'm sure many of you know that South Korea was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, to achieve full smartphone penetration, right? Like essentially 100% penetration by 2010. So around that time, we got a call from South Korea Telecom inviting us to come over there and sitting down with them and brainstorming about how to monetize telecom data. What was happening was, these guys were some of the pioneers in figuring out that the future of telecom is not in voice, call, or minutes or texting. It's actually in advertising. Okay? You see this now increasingly in India, but that's like, I'm talking about 10 years before. The Koreans figured it out before anybody else on the planet, that they can be a credible threat to the next Google or Facebook or Amazon. And so over the last few years, I worked with several telecom providers in Europe, in Asia, and North America in helping them monetize consumer data. So just to give you an example, if you hit enter, you will see the arrows come up. So the first dot is essentially the consumer's home location, and the second dot is their work location. So imagine a consumer commuting from home to work. This is your typical Monday to Friday, right? A lot of us do this. You go to office, come back. But then sometimes, occasionally, maybe on the weekend or maybe on another weekday, you take a detour. Okay, you don't necessarily go back from home to office, but you make multiple stops. Maybe you're going to meet a friend, maybe you're going to a shopping mall, maybe you're going to a client meeting, variety of reasons. But all of this information exists with your Reliance and Airtel, and here with Verizon and AT&T, and in Korea with South Korea Telecom. So the Koreans said, look, we are pretty sure that in this low margin telecom business, the only way to survive is we've got to convert ourselves into a tech company, into an ad tech company. So that started a decade-long collaboration with these companies where, I've frequently gone there and helped build the data science models that they can then leverage to monetize this data in the form of advertising. So in other words, a simple question is, if a brand wants to partner with a telecom provider in sending contextually targeted ads, which day and which place and what time should they send these ads? Okay, so the core idea is send the right offer to the right person at the right time, on the right location, on the right device. You can keep increasing the number of things you need to get right. And the more you get right, the more accuracy you get and the more redemption rates you get. Okay. So next slide. This is, like I said, we did several years of work with them. Now let's go to London. Okay, so this is in the UK. If you've been to London, you recognize this area. This is, the Trafalgar Square, which is next to Piccadilly Circus, in fact. And the Brits in Europe, there's a tremendous sort of regulatory constraints, and I've been involved in these regulatory battles from a different capacity as an expert witness. And so I've seen the other side of this. Despite the regulations in Europe about these sort of targeting and monetizing consumer data, the Brits were actually the first to figure out that you can have personalized billboards that can identify consumers in the close proximity and send them messages and offers that are very relevant to them. Okay? And we saw examples of several brands. We saw Coke and Samsung and Hyundai and L'Oreal and eBay. And over time, they've gotten more sophisticated actually in identifying the number plate of the car. And it's quite fascinating to see what was happening out there. So anyway, so this sort of success, next slide, this sort of success led us to think about, the first example was smartphone targeting. The next example was billboard targeting. How about we combine the two? Okay, so now I'll take you to Tokyo. This is in Japan, obviously, and this is the place called Shibuya Crossing, which if you've been to Tokyo, you recognize, like several thousands of people cross. This is like Times Square in New York City, for instance. Like thousands of people cross this one intersection every single day. It's almost like the Broadway of New York City. But this area is also home to some of the largest electronic billboards in the planet. Okay, it's very dense, but they're also very good at figuring things out. So we started looking at this opportunity to see what if, in collaboration again with the telecom providers and with the ad tech companies and obviously the brands, what if we can target a group of people who see the billboard ad as they're crossing Shibuya? Let's say it's today's Tuesday, it's about 7:20 p.m. They're crossing Shibuya, they get to see the Nike ad that pops up. And at the same time, a fraction of those people also get a targeted Nike offer on their phone. It's almost, magical, right? The shock and awe kind of thing. So you see the billboard ad and you see the Nike offer with a 25% discount. The Nike store is just, 10 meters away from where you are, just below the billboard. Well, does that change consumer behavior? Does that prompt people to walk into the stores and engage with the products? Not necessarily buy, but at least then we get them inside the store. Then it's up to the salespeople to actually cross-sell or upsell. And we saw a 400% increase in these sort of redemptions, right? So these things actually work. And this was a useful learning because, we also face critics who say, well, billboards don't work. Who looks at billboards, right? But it turns out billboards still work. The old traditional mechanism still works. So we got a lot of success, with these sort of campaigns. And that sort of, as you can imagine, emboldened us to try a few different things, take some more risks, so to speak. Okay, so next slide. I'll now take you to another interesting, and this is going back to Europe. This is the largest mobile targeting project done anywhere on the planet. We worked with 3,500 different, it was a huge consortium. It took me 2 years to do all the paperwork and get over the legal formalities. But we work with 3,500 companies in Europe across 374 cities and towns. But the question was very simple, because the question is, okay, so imagine, you have your favorite shopping mall, right? Think about Shoppers Stop. And let's say you live about 100 meters from Shoppers Stop, but your friend lives a mile away from Shoppers Stop. Now, it turns out that all the shopping malls in most of them in the world, when they send promotional offers on a given day, it's the same offer to everybody. So we said, why don't we make a small tweak? We are going to customize the offers based on how far you live from the mall. And the mall is just one example. We've done this now with a variety of different institutions. So in other words, who would need a higher incentive to come to the mall? You, who lives 100 meters away, or your friend who lives 2 miles away? But clearly your friend. I mean, his transportation cost is much higher than yours, so he or she will need a bigger incentive. So that's what we did. We worked in collaboration, again, with a consortium of tech companies, telecom providers, advertisers, agencies, to put together this infrastructure where people living closer to these institutions would actually get a lower discount, and people living further away will get a higher discount. Okay? And this was a great success, even in a place as privacy conscious, as tech conscious as Europe. This was a phenomenal success. Okay, so next slide. Let me now take you back to Asia, and this was an interesting question as well. So I've given you location-based targeting, context-based targeting, time-based targeting. Now I'm going to talk about crowdedness, right? So what do I mean by that? So imagine, you're commuting, okay? So you're commuting, and whether it's a subway train or an over-the-ground train or, a bus, whatever it is, typically during commuting hours, we are, in a crowded context. Now, what's the first thing that we all do when we are in a crowded context in a commuting scenario? Well, how many of us read a physical newspaper, right? We don't read the newspapers anymore. We take our phones out and we immerse ourselves in the phone, right? Like your phone becomes your escape. That's your private space. So this was a conversation with, several sort of, local provincial governors in China. So this is one of the earliest projects I did in China, where in particular with, the province of Shanghai, we started talking with telecom providers. So these guys basically saw what was happening in Korea and what was happening in Europe and said, we want to do something similar. So what does crowdedness here mean? So next slide, you will see that crowdedness essentially says how many people in a given time are in your immediate vicinity, okay? So the question we were asking is, should marketers send you offers in highly crowded context, or should they send you messages when you're less crowded? Okay. In other words, when are you more likely to respond to a messaging? And it doesn't necessarily have to be offers or commercial messaging, right? It can be any sort of communication. So this started, a series of randomized field experiments. And like I said at the beginning, I've always been interested in causality, not just in pure prediction. Prediction is very easy to do, but causality is significantly harder. And so the trade-off is when you're trying to really understand consumer behavior, it's not sufficient to just focus on prediction. You really have to get inside the consumer's mind, and that's where causality comes in. And when you're interested in causality, you have to do it the right way, which is the randomized control trials, right? Like you can't just take a data set from a company and impose a model on it. That's going to lead to several constraints on what you can do. But if you can convince a company to run large-scale randomized control experiments, that's significantly more precise. So again, this was an uphill battle in the sense that we had to convince a consortium of companies to come together, agree with us, agree to our strategy and design, and then eventually implement it. Finally, we got over the hurdles and we were able to run these very large-scale experiments in different cities. And just sorry, if you can skip a couple of slides, I can get to the results. Yeah, this one. So here what we find is that as the crowdedness increases, the redemption rates actually increase. In other words, people are responding better to communication with companies when they are in more crowded context. Okay, and the maximum limit is 5. After 5, it becomes way too crowded, right? But clearly, you see the slope is upward. It's an upward-facing slope in the sense that redemption rates continue to increase. We then replicated this in the Middle East, in other parts of the world. So there was nothing unique about folks in China. We saw similar results in several other countries. And the core idea was basically people said, look, when we are in a commuting context, the people around you are all strangers. You don't necessarily do small talk with strangers. You don't, you definitely don't make eye contact because that's considered rude. So you take your phone out, you immerse yourself in the phone, and that becomes your private escape. And so if companies can figure out how to target you with the right message, with the right tone, the right content during those times, you're far more likely to act upon those messages. Yeah. So we tested this with a variety of different products, from low price products to more expensive products, and it turns out the qualitative nature of these insights was very similar. Okay. Okay, so that takes me to then the next project, which is basically going to be about the last the one that I'll talk about from a commercial perspective. This to me is the most forward-looking of them all. Next slide. Imagine you are in a shopping mall. Okay, so you can see the red dot near the Apple Store. Now I'm just going to hit enter and then tell you a story. Okay. So the red dot indicates that this gentleman is standing in front of the Apple Store. But before he came to the Apple Store, he went to the Samsung store. Then from the Samsung store, he went to the Huawei store. From the Huawei store, he went to the Oppo store. From Oppo, he went to the Google Pixel store. And then he came to the Apple store. So now contrast the scenarios that in the first situation, you only observe that this person is in front of the Apple store. In the second situation, you observe that before they came to the Apple store, this person actually went to multiple other competing stores. Okay, yeah, you can skip forward this, Surya. So what this means is, the question that was on our mind was, can we build a machine learning and AI-based recommendation system in the offline world? Why we were very excited about this is, think about all the recommender systems that we know exist today. They all exist in the online world, Netflix and Amazon and Spotify and so on. So we were the first to design and implement and execute this in the real world, in the offline physical world, where in real time, these shopping malls or department stores or airport, we've also worked with airports in different parts of the world, where these institutions can monitor your trajectories in real time and send you personalized recommendations on your phone. Okay? And the core idea was, instead of simply using the customer's real-time location, can you use more detailed trajectory data? So lots of examples here. I'm not going to get into the details, but over and over again, we started this about 4 or 5 years back and replicated this now in different parts of the world, in different institutions, airports, shopping malls, department stores, etc. Very clearly, this Wi-Fi based trajectory works very well. Okay. Now let's go to the last project, which is one more slide. So the last one is personally one of my favorites because this has less of a commercial, more of a social welfare application to it. So what I mean is, as I learned how to monetize, consumer data, I started getting more and more interested in consumers' health, right? I mean, so there was a part of us which said, look, we have now helped many companies in many parts of the world to monetize consumer data. And most of the time it's been a win-win. But now can we take a detour and do something that is broader, more social welfare enhancing? So the last few years, I've been working with hospitals and doctors and patients and the whole healthcare system to figuring out how to monetize, how to leverage mobile health data to benefit patients from a variety of chronic disease contexts like diabetes, blood pressure, sugar, this and so on. So I'll give you one quick example of this. And in the next slide, you will see this question of, basically the question is simple, right? As we saw the emergence of wearable device companies and mobile health apps, the big question on everybody's mind was, does it really matter? Like, do people actually change their behavior after they adopt wearable devices? Do they exercise more, walk more, sleep more, eat more healthy? Like, is there any evidence that these things actually matter? And then the follow-up question is, does it matter the short term, or can you fundamentally change their behavior so that they have lower hospital visits, lower doctor visits, and so on? So this started, a multi-year journey where I sort of, my collaborators and I, essentially worked with, again, there's multiple stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem, but the core infrastructure, the AI piece was really coming from mobile phones, right? And this is where we were leveraging our prior expertise in commercializing mobile data. So again, we carried out a number of randomized field experiments. And the good news is that, yes, the answer to both these questions is, after about a 15-month period, Yes, about just a little less than a year and a half, we have now found statistically significant concrete evidence that chronic disease patients are in fact definitively and unequivocally benefiting in the short term by reducing their blood glucose and blood pressure and glycemic and hemoglobin levels, but in the long term the reduction of these ailments is reducing their hospital visits and doctor visits, the medicines they have to take, the dosage, symptoms. So net, there's a lot of good news coming out of this healthcare ecosystem. And so this started, several other follow-up projects, which I can talk about later on. Okay, so then that brings me to the, you can skip, Jayasuriya. That brings me to the last, next one. Next, keep going. I just want to talk a little bit about blockchain. This is where blockchain comes in. Now, so, a significant part of the last 20 years, essentially, like I alluded to, I've been working on in this domain of AI to apply this. One thing that always nagged me personally, and then as a team, we have a large team of collaborators. Collectively, we thought that sometimes the data we have to work with has these discrepancies, which we don't know why it's happening, or maybe we know, but we don't quite know how to isolate it. But it's really nagging, and it sort of sometimes undermines the quantitative values to a non-trivial extent, and we were always bothered by this. So in 2017, there's a very interesting company here in the US called Lucidity. They invited me to join their board. And one of the exciting opportunities I had after I joined the board was this is the largest blockchain ad tech blockchain company in the US. Okay, so they provide the underlying blockchain infrastructure for the advertising economy in the US. And I said, look, have you ever sort of tried to measure whether or not blockchain actually helps? Like, this is another fundamental question, right? Everybody's selling blockchain, but is it snake oil or is it really genuine? Like, has anybody even quantified this? And the founders of this company are very obviously super smart and very forward-looking, and they already started putting together these randomized controlled trials to examine the effectiveness of blockchain, especially in the world of ad fraud. And when I say ad fraud, I mean, this may not be news to many of you, but at least 25% of the advertising in the digital economy is fraud. Okay, this fraud happens from a variety of ways. Bot fraud, click fraud, and we can get into details. But this led us to think about, can we actually measure the effectiveness of these technologies? So in the next slide, you will see that I'll give you an intuitive reason why this data discrepancy or this fraud exists. So forget about the ad tech season for a second. Think about our everyday banking system, okay? Let's say every month, we get a salary and, we have a fixed salary. So every month you're supposed to see the, let's say $1,000 a month is your ATM entry. That's your salary, okay? So turns out that in the counterfactual world, imagine instead of a fixed $1,000, some months you see, 1,500, some months you see 700, some months you see 900. And that wouldn't be great, right? Like, why would there be this sort of data discrepancy? And so this is an analogy where in the advertising world, when you look at the data from different lenses, quite often, 1 out of 5 times, it doesn't seem consistent. There are major inconsistencies. So next slide, you will see this prompted Lucidity in us to work with some of the world's largest brands to measure whether or not blockchain works. And one example I'll give you is Toyota. Everybody knows Toyota. So we worked with them over a few weeks, before and after blockchain, and then we were able to show a 21% improvement in their advertising campaign performance after the use of blockchain. It was all attributed to being able to identify fraud, okay? In other words, before blockchain, the system was susceptible to fraud and we couldn't really isolate it, but after that, we could. And there's a few other examples that we can talk about as well. Which finally brings me to the last topic, and very quickly in about a couple of minutes, I'll talk a little bit about privacy. So next slide, yeah. So I think no discussion of data and monetization can happen without discussion of privacy and regulation, right? And like I said, outside of being a professor at NYU, I have several other engagements, one of which is that I'm actively involved in the regulatory antitrust lawsuits and the privacy lawsuits here in the US and sometimes in Europe. So I testify as an expert witness in many of these, lawsuits, and which has also been, a great learning for me, because this way I now have sort of, almost unfettered access to the infrastructure of these big tech companies. Legally, I am allowed to, ask for whatever I want, and it's been quite eye-opening because the narrative in the media is very different from reality. And this is a euphemism, but one of the things I've learned over time is the media has their own incentive to paint big tech in a negative way, and you can put two and two together. 2/3 of the advertising dollars of New York Times and CNN and Wall Street Journal have been taken over by big tech, right? Not because of bad conduct, that's just competition. But you'll never see, whenever you see a journalist criticizing tech, they will not declare this conflict of interest. So, suffices to say there is a different narrative that's also worth exploring. And one of the things, as an expert, I have to use data to prove all of this. And one of the things you have seen is, unlike the narrative in the media that big tech is a big monopoly, it turns out that there are significant, multi-homing. The fact that same consumer is now on multiple platforms. The same consumer has an account in TikTok, on Instagram, on Snapchat, for instance, and many other competing platforms, which makes this monopoly, it's not a monopoly anymore if multiple companies have access to the same consumer's data. It's also non-rivalrous. Secondly, and many of you worked in data science, you'll agree with me that it's not just access to big data that makes somebody successful, it's the ability to really harness it through your own internal resources. Yeah? And third, a big part of my research has been about privacy. So consumers care about data, and there's a big fundamental disconnect between what they say and what they actually do. It turns out, despite the fact that consumers say they care about their data, they're very much willing to exchange it with companies for various benefits. This has been the core of my book as well. Okay? So I'll end this discussion here with the last slide, where I say, look, what did I learn from all of this? Well, clearly, the one message I'd like to leave with you guys is, this framework, mobile and AI in blockchain, is powerful, and that framework gives us access to 9 forces, which individually are effective in commercializing consumer data, but also collectively. The good news for those of us who care about data veracity is that blockchain can now be used to ascertain fraud. We now have evidence. And finally, it's really important to have this conversation about privacy and regulation, but understand the consumer mindset. Unlike the narrative in the media, which is all about, making big tech sort of the enemy of the gates, the reality is quite different. The reality is that consumers are willing to exchange this with your companies. At the same time, companies who are successful are the ones who are butlers. Essentially, they take your data and they make your lives better, but they're not stalkers. They don't invade your privacy. Okay? So I'll leave it at that. And, Ganesh, over to you. Happy to have any conversation with you.
Sure, thanks, Anand. That was a whirlwind tour of a fascinating area of data. Thank you so much for that. Let me push back on your last point, the privacy point. I mean, you mentioned that, look, customers are willing to share data with maybe users or whoever, but don't you feel that, what they're willing to share on their own terms? But recently somebody just introduced me to a person and said, you might like to talk to this guy. And this happened on WhatsApp. Before I know it, I get a pop-up on Facebook saying, would you like this guy to be your friend? And obviously, you know where it's coming from. But I couldn't resist a moment of irritation. So are we finding that privacy is more about you don't tell me what to do, but if I ask for help, I don't mind being. What is your research showing you?
Yeah, no, very, very nicely put. In fact, the last sentence, Ganesh, is my butler analogy that, you don't have to tell me what I should do, but if I ask you as a butler, you should be all aboard and tell me everything, right? And the companies who've been successful at treading that thin line are the ones who are butlers. The first part of your question is the stalker. This is intrusive, you're bombarding me, annoying me. And all these examples I talked about are the ones who are doing successfully navigating the thin line, and they are trying to become your butlers, and they are doing it in a way where it's a win-win. Now that's sort of the high level, and then of course there's this also interesting demographic shift. So the youngest generation, the I generation, people who got an iPhone when they were 12. I think the iPhone came out in 2007. So the people, the anthropologists refer to people born after 1995 as the I generation. So something interesting I learned during the process. So the I generation, the millennials, the Gen Zs, they have also figured out that they believe that their data is their asset that they should be able to exchange with companies for some sort of monetary benefit or some sort of convenience. And again, we are seeing this ecosystem as we speak developing, where I don't think we have really nailed it, but several elements of this ecosystem are being put in place. I think eventually I can almost imagine like a data marketplace where there would be more transparency, almost like an auction. A consumer comes and says, "Oh, here's my data, and how much a brand is willing to pay me for it." I think we're sort of headed in that direction. Part of the reason I feel a little more optimistic about that is the advent of blockchain, as you know, provides more transparency.
In fact, there's a related question from Ravi Shankar on the whole blockchain thing. I mean, his question is, does this AI blockchain model work only for consumer products and not for custom-made industrial and auto products? And in fact, I have a corollary to that, so maybe you can handle both together. You mentioned about Toyota and the 21% improvement in campaign effectiveness. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, where exactly did blockchain fit in this?
Yeah, definitely. So this is essentially Toyota's marketing campaign on different, digital media channels. So essentially they were targeting consumers on search engines, on social media, on streaming TV, on, those guys who watch TV on their desktop, in a variety of different channels. And this was a combination of different campaigns, primarily display ads and video ads. Okay. Now, in the past, before the use of blockchain, we were looking at very high cost of acquisition, very low return on investment. And a big part of that, eventually we isolated that, was that 21% number, which is essentially a reduction in their costs and an increase in the ROI, was coming because we were able to isolate the fraud. Fraud was coming from click fraud and ad fraud and bot fraud. And this is a thriving economy. A couple of years back, there were hackers from Russia who were able to get $30 million per day just by hacking into this whole digital ad economy. So I think going back to the bigger question, I have not seen any evidence that this would not work this would not work in B2B context. I think, over the years, B2B tends to be about 3 to 5 years behind B2C in adopting anything new, right? So I do anticipate that as we see more B2C applications of AI and blockchain, we will start to see some of these in the B2B world as well.
That's interesting. Other question was on, the point you mentioned a little earlier on about this whole, your interest in causality versus predictive. Talk a little bit more about that. Just can you give us a couple of examples of what you discovered that was interesting about causality?
Yeah, so at the high level, Ganesh, prediction is about forecasting. It's like trying to ask the question, what will happen next? Causality is about trying to explain what already happened, meaning understanding why did my customer behave in this way? Why did they change their mind, or why did they not act upon this intervention? So, prediction, and I sort of, meant it with all seriousness when I said that prediction is very easy to do now that, we have all this data, we have all this infrastructure, it's just a matter of fitting the data into a regression line, for instance, and predicting what will happen, right? Prediction is useful, and please don't get me wrong, but, causality is significantly more helpful and informative, because until and unless one can understand why my customer is behaving in a certain way, it's very hard to change the behavior, right? So yes, prediction might tell me that okay, where will my customer go next? He just spent, like, with the shopping mall example, he went to the Samsung store, then the Huawei store, then a Google store. Where will he go next? Okay, so well, with some minimal effort, you can predict that he'll probably go to the Apple store. But the question is, will he act upon my intervention? Why not? If so, why? So that's where causality comes in. So to understand the customer's thinking, that's why we need to design these large-scale randomized controlled trials. Okay? And this is, in sort of the macroeconomic world, right? Like people who study sort of, social welfare issues. Did this government policy help increase welfare of consumers in this village, right? That's very similar, except that we are looking at this in a very business context. We are saying, did this marketing policy change the customer's propensity to buy the product in a shopping context?
Okay, that's interesting. Somebody's asking, as a mid-sized FMCG company, we're exploring a direct-to-consumer model where Amazon and Flipkart have troves of customer data points to analyze. How do we compete? I think it's not about more in terms of not having a significant volume of data, so can they still do predictive?
Sorry, I missed the last part, Ganesh. What was the question again?
Part of it, like Amazon and others, I mean, they have a lot of data to play with. But I mean, let's talk about being an FMCG company and limited customers. So can they still use data to be really intelligent?
Oh, right. Yeah, so, a lot of these engagements, as I sort of described, this was a consortium, right? In the sense that this is a multi-stakeholder collaboration. For sure, it's relatively easier for a Flipkart or an Amazon to do this, but if you are a smaller company or if you're an FMCG company, you'll probably have a lot of first-party data, but you probably don't have third-party data. And that's why you need to work with your media agency, who in turn will work with a ad tech company. So it's going to be a consortium. Now, that being said, one of the interesting things that's happening is in the next 2 years, Google is going to remove all third-party cookies. And, this is a very interesting development. What will then happen to, is this going to make the big tech companies even more powerful, or is it going to allow entry of newer companies who don't rely on third-party data? I think it's I don't know if anybody really knows definitively, but it's a fascinating question.
I know. So there's a long question here. So, and this actually is about my favorite professor in Harvard, Shoshana Zuboff. So he's saying that you mentioned that media has a tendency to paint big technology in a negative way. However, the trend is not only restricted to media, because Professor Shoshana Zuboff from Harvard has written this book titled Surveillance Capitalism, where she accuses the FANG of illegally collecting data and using it to fundamentally change the behavior of consumers. Your work also involves collecting data and then targeting monetization. What are your views on the accusations of Professor Zuboff and the likes?
Yeah, good question. First of all, great question. So I personally obviously have a big problem with Professor, and I respect her and I work a lot, but we've publicly debated on this issue a lot, and so I can at least tell you what we publicly debated. So I think, look, has there ever been an example of a company that has crossed a certain line? Of course, there has been an example, okay? But do most or all companies consciously, violate that line? Absolutely not. This is where she and I differ on this issue. Okay, so surveillance capitalism, is an extremely, again, in my opinion, based on my experience, extremely narrow view of how these companies work, or rather a narrow view of their incentives. Many of you, maybe you are CTOs or CIOs, or maybe you have friends who are in that domain. You talk to any CIO or a CTO, they have very little incentive to design an infrastructure that intentionally violates somebody's privacy or security, okay? Because, this is not a short-term game. Yes, you can benefit, if you're myopic, you can benefit in the short term, but it's a much more longer-term game. And I think over the last few years, companies have realized that if you really be patient and you become that butler and not that stalker, you'll have a much higher customer lifetime value than if you tend to sort of slip and have this short-term view. So yeah, I think, I'm obviously happy to talk a lot more about this, but at the high level, I would say that the vast majority of companies I've worked with, and at this point it's more than 50 in like multiple countries, are very conscious. They're very cognizant of their responsibilities with consumer data. They're very conscious about how they protect it. But they also live in an adversarial world where hackers, independent third-party people, are always trying to breach their barriers, right? And you can imagine if that's an adversarial world, this is not going to go away anytime soon. The strongest companies will always be susceptible to this sort of third-party security breaches. But at the same time, internally, they have sort of matured a lot in thinking about how to protect consumer data, but also create this win-win. So I would say, suffice to say, I disagree with the professor quite a bit, but let's leave it at that.
Okay, then another question around you talk about GDPR and increasing data privacy, watchdogs, data control laws, etc. So he says, will companies get more and more wary about using data because you never know where you are kind of treading the legality line or the privacy line? Is that going to be an issue going forward?
So GDPR is an interesting regulation. So before it came out, like mentioned, I've been part of these regulatory lawsuits quite a bit, and personally, I was very much vocally opposed to GDPR for a number of reasons, but I'll give you two in particular. We always knew, given the formulation of GDPR, this is only going to make the strong stronger and the weak weaker. In other words, the bigger companies will continue to benefit and the smaller companies will continue to get hurt. And it's not just because of the cost of compliance, which like the Sarbanes-Oxley or the Y2K problem, this is a big cost of compliance problem for the smaller firms. But also the way GDPR is actually written, it actually empowers the bigger companies to enable some of those policies, but it really handicaps the smaller companies. And it turns out that a number of recent academics here and some of my marketing colleagues have actually now documented that in the last 2 years, GDPR has actually hurt the smaller companies significantly than the bigger companies. So I think the good news is that for us in the US, we have a little more reasonable version of GDPR, the California privacy law. This is done in a way that's almost a win-win. It's relatively easier to sort of execute and implement. It doesn't burden smaller companies with high cost of compliance or high infrastructure investments, and it makes execution more feasible. And one example I'll tell you, GDPR says, let's take the example of Flipkart. So GDPR says the following: if Ganesh, Flipkart shows you a watch ad for the Rolex watch, okay, and Flipkart shows me an ad for the Breitling watch. Now the Rolex is worth 25 US grand and the Breitling is worth 15 grand. If I feel that I've been, if my ego has been bruised, GDPR says I as a consumer have the power to go to Flipkart and says, why did you show me a cheaper watch? Why did you show him a more expensive watch? It's ridiculous, right? I mean, just think about the feasibility of what this really means. And I'm not being fastidious when I say that, GDPR really handicaps companies in a number of different ways. To be fair, I think the Germans, when they thought about this first, they had the right intention, but populism and political agendas drove the Europeans to a very narrow version of GDPR that really constrains companies.
I totally agree, actually, but that's the way it is. Okay, last couple of questions. One is, of course, somebody saying a lot of hype regarding voice data for the future of marketing. But in his understanding, the adoption rates of voice search in India is still very low. So do you think that voice data is going to be a big deal?
Oh, great question. I love the question because, we just started working with, about a year back with Alibaba in sort of using their voice conversational commerce. So Alibaba and another South Korean company, two different projects. We actually have a working paper on that. And, if anybody's interested, please email me. I can send you our working papers that has all the details about. We eventually show, again, through randomized control experiments, that the adoption of voice AI, voice commerce by Amazon or Flipkart or Walmart or, Alibaba, these companies clearly is expanding the e-commerce market. So people definitely are sort of sitting at home, are sort of ordering things on their voice devices. And it's not a reallocation from smartphone to voice or from desktop to voice. It's actually a market expansion effect. So that's definitely the good news over there.
Okay, and somebody also talking about India specifically. So I don't know how much you'd like to comment on that, but he says you mentioned deploying offline AI-based recognition systems. And could you share pertinent applications for a context like India, given the fact that we have a very nascent digital infrastructure, and also a separate question on are there real examples of blockchain in India?
Yeah. So the first one, and I'm very happy to share that. So I sit on the board of iBus Networks, which is a company based in Bangalore, and some of you may know of them. So they have now been actually working with a number of shopping malls. I spoke with their board last month to get an update, and they've also implemented this technology where they can measure foot traffic as the number of people going inside the malls, how many people are going, then they are sending them with targeted personalized content and ads and so on. So as a board member, I'm helping them build a data science platform, and we are going to run some experiments over the next few months. We got a little bit delayed this year because of COVID. We are actually supposed to already finish it this year. But as things start to open up, next year looks a lot more promising. So definitely, in India, we are in a very good position to sort of, get inspiration from our friends in Asia and replicate many of these. The other question was about blockchain, right?
Yeah, again, Indian applications.
So I have not yet personally seen a widespread blockchain application. I've had conversation with some of the leaders in the Indian industry about doing this. Hopefully, it's a matter of time that we will see this. I think, to be honest and to be completely frank, even in the US, blockchain adoption has been a little bit slower than what we initially thought. It's been significantly faster, I would say, in Japan, South Korea, China, and some of the Far East Asian countries, Singapore, for instance. I do think the last 4 years in the US was an anomaly, right? I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. We had a government, we had a society that none of that felt normal. So things got slowed down significantly for all the wrong reasons. But now, the future looks bright. We have a new administration, a normal president and a normal administration. So, things should pick up from here.
So I certainly won't ask you who you voted for.
Oh, I'll tell you, I voted for Biden.
Okay, we'll close with one last question, which is, of course, everybody's favorite question to everybody. So what do you think is going to be the scenario post-COVID? Will people go back to their old habits, or is there going to be a fundamental change in the way business?
Yeah, this is a question that we've all been grappling with, and I think we are going to see some fundamental changes. I'll give you concrete examples without speculating too much. So again, since I'm here in New York City, what am I hearing about companies? Okay, significant portions of companies have now said there is no coming to office. Okay, this is work from home for the rest of our lives. So from almost all of Twitter to several units in other big tech companies like Google's and Facebook's and Amazon's, okay, there is no coming to office. In academic university, in academic settings, in universities, we have very comfortably sort of moved on to online teaching. However, I don't think that will be the status quo. I think we'll start doing hybrid. Why I say this, because in academic institutions, the value that students get is not just from the classroom and from the professor. The value they get is from the interaction with each other and the networking. This is not something they can do as well online. So I think in academia, we will see hybrids. Professors may teach online some classes, but some session might be in person as well. But definitely in the corporate world, and I think this is going to have implication for cities. Like I live in New York City, and we talk about the impact on real estate, right? If people are migrating away from big cities into smaller cities, okay, or the suburbs, this is going to have an impact on commercial real estate. This is going to have an impact on restaurants and stores. So I think we don't really quite know exactly how things will pan out, but if I have to give you a number, I would say cities will have a 10-15% of a negative impact because of people migrating out and people continue to work from home. At the same time, human beings, we are creatures of habit. We like interacting with people. So I don't see a world where we'll completely go back to completely be work from home. I do see this flexible policies in organizations where they'll say, okay, you can come once or twice a week to office. You don't have to come every day.
No, you're absolutely right. And very close by. I mean, first of all, I completely agree with you on the New York story because I have a daughter who's a cancer specialist in Sloan Kettering. And even
Oh,
she, in spite of seeing patients and running her own lab in MSK, is actually now buying a place in, on the Hudson Valley. She's saying that no,
yeah,
this is going to be, working from wherever. So
yeah,
I'll be here in New York 4 days and then maybe disappear into the valley. So it's actually interesting. I also think it's a great opportunity for India because we keep talking about redistribution of jobs and there's excessive urbanization. But I think it may be
yeah,
good if when a lot of people start working from the Ranchis and Patnas rather than everybody flocking to the Mumbais and Delhi. So I think that's going to be
yeah,
interesting. To the
yeah,
question on AI and blockchain, I mean, I'm on the board of State Bank of India and also chair the digital committee. I think even a company, an entity like State Bank, which is huge, but obviously one of the old banks, the kind of
hmm,
implementations and investments in AI, blockchain, all kinds of new digital technology is tremendous. So I think for many of you who are asking questions, I think India, I mean, like Anindya said, B2B may lag a little bit, and maybe India may lag the US a little bit. Ultimately, it's all going to happen here as well. So I think it was
yeah,
a
yeah,
fascinating discussion on India, and thank you so much for really enlightening us. And look forward to more interactions with you at some point. Thank you so much.
yeah. No,